Hey guys, what's up? Dr. Shepard here. I want to talk to you today about a trick to help with anxiety. So if I have not talked about this before, I must have, but if I haven't, this is a trick that comes from cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. So CBT is a great treatment approach for things like anxiety and depression. And even if you don't have anxiety and depression, CBT can be really, really helpful. So I definitely use it like day-to-day situations, just in general, like coping with things, dealing with stress. It's super helpful. So this is something called the anxiety equation, and it's part of CBT. What the anxiety equation does is helps us evaluate a situation where we are anxious. And so this equation is going to work better if you are in a situation where the anxiety sort of makes more sense. So if the anxiety comes out of nowhere or is super irrational, then it may not be as helpful, and we'll certainly talk about other techniques for dealing with that kind of anxiety. But this anxiety equation is something that is probably most helpful for dealing with stressful situations, or in times when anxiety kind of makes sense. So the anxiety equation basically says that the level of anxiety that you're going to be dealing with in a situation is equal to the perceived danger of that situation over your perceived ability to deal with that danger or that situation. So notice that I am saying perceived in both of those parts of the equation. That is because anxiety is really not rooted in fact usually. Anxiety is a lot more feelings based and has a lot more to do with how you're thinking and feeling than what the actual facts are. If you've ever had a completely irrational thing that you're anxious about, then you know just as well that facts are not necessarily what is driving your anxiety. It may make no sense. So it's really what your brain is perceiving as the dangerousness and your ability to deal with the anxiety. So let's break this down into its components a little bit more. So let's talk about the top variables first. So the perceived danger of the situation that you're in. We can think about that as being the likelihood of a bad outcome happening, or the likelihood of the worst case scenario happening, times the awfulness of that scenario happening. So likelihood times awfulness. So let me give you a couple examples. For example, if you are deathly afraid of flying in an airplane, but you have literally never needed to fly before and you never anticipate needing to fly in the future, then even though the awfulness is pretty high, the likelihood of that fear coming to fruition is going to be fairly low. So your day-to-day anxiety in that case is going to be on the lower end. So similarly, we can talk about maybe a situation that would be the reverse of that. So say you are afraid of getting a paper cut. So you know that the likelihood of getting a paper cut is pretty darn high. If you haven't had a paper cut before, that's crazy. Good for you. But most of us will get paper cuts, and we will get them quite often. So the likelihood in that situation is going to be fairly high. Well, why aren't we super anxious about it all the time then? Because the awfulness factor is very low. So we know we will survive most paper cuts, that we will not go on to have this awful experience and, ultimately die from our paper cuts. We'll probably be okay. So in that situation, your perceived danger is relatively low because the awfulness factor is down, even though the likelihood is fairly high. All right, so let's talk about the bottom of this equation to give you a couple of examples. So the perceived ability to deal with the situation. So when we are talking about perceived ability to deal, there are two factors in that. So your ability to cope, and then also any potential rescue that might be available to you if the worst case scenario were to come to fruition. Let's break that down a little bit more. So as far as coping, say you're afraid you're going to lose your job. If you know that you can cope with that because you have 6 months of savings stored up, that's going to be a lot less anxiety provoking than if you do not know that you have that, and you do not know that you have the ability to cope with the potential job loss. And on the flip side, if you are afraid of oversleeping because you know you couldn't cope with the consequences of that, for example, like say this is your last time that you're allowed to be tardy and you end up suspended or something. So say you don't believe you could cope with that situation, but the potential for rescue is very high because you know that your mom will wake you up if you oversleep. So that's an example of overall the ability to deal with the situation is relatively high, resulting in relatively low anxiety. Let's take a more common anxiety scenario and use this equation to look into it. So a lot of people are afraid of public speaking. It's probably the most common fear that people have. So how can we use this equation to help us with public speaking? Well, like we said earlier, we can work on decreasing the perceived danger, which is going to be the likelihood times the awfulness, or we can work on increasing the perceived ability to deal with the potential bad situation, which is going to be increasing your ability to cope or increasing the rescue. And in order to change any of those variables, we can do it one of two ways. So we can change the actual variable itself. So like actually finding out the likelihood being much lower than we thought it originally was, or we can change our perception of each variable. So maybe we started out thinking we didn't have the ability to cope with some scenario, but then kind of coaching ourselves through it and saying, no, wait, I guess I would be okay if this happened. All right, so when it comes to public speaking, we're gonna first work on changing our perception of the dangerousness of that event. So again, looking at likelihood times awfulness. So likelihood can be addressed by either helping yourself understand that, you know, most people actually do pretty well when they do public speaking, or helping yourself understand that you really actually haven't botched speeches in the past and all your past speeches have been really good, in fact, and you've been complimented on it before. So that's sort of changing the perception that you'll do poorly during this speech. You can also change the likelihood factor by figuring out ways that you can prepare for the speech. So maybe you have things written out. I am the queen of over preparing for that kind of stuff because I think in my mind, it certainly decreases the likelihood that I'm going to make an error. And if I do make an error, I'll be able to get back on track quickly. So having that likelihood be lower, it helps my mind understand that the dangerousness factor is lower and therefore my anxiety is lower. So then we'll consider awfulness. When people have to do public speaking, they very much so tend to overestimate the potential for awfulness. So you might find yourself really worried that people are going to be awful to you and you may lose your job if you do poorly at this speech, or you may never get that promotion you've been gunning for. And in reality, one speech probably isn't really going to change that for you. So our brains tend to anticipate worst case scenarios, and you will find that you are sort of subconsciously assuming that if you were to mess up, the awfulness factor would be super duper high. So you want to take a step back and kind of remind yourself that, you know, even if you do screw up the speech, it probably isn't going to be the end of the world. You're probably not going to remember it in 20 years from now. You probably won't lose your job, and you probably will still get that promotion that you're hoping for. So reframing the potential for awfulness and kind of following that through to the end. So what if the worst case scenario did happen and I did mess up my speech? What would be the consequences of that? If you can kind of step back and look at that logically, it can really help you decrease the perceived dangerousness and decrease the overall anxiety. We move to the bottom of the equation and we are talking about your ability to deal with an anxiety-provoking situation. So we want to increase either one of those variables, your ability to cope and the ability to get rescued in that situation, which sounds a little bit funny, but just hang with me. So for public speaking in particular, if you are thinking that when you stumble over some words, you won't be able to get back on track, that would be an example of having a fear of being unable to cope with that scenario. Another example of thinking that you're unable to cope with a situation could be if people are going to be asking questions during your speech, having the fear that you may not be able to answer those questions. So changing your perceived ability to cope can be really helpful. And again, you can do this by changing the perception itself. So reminding yourself maybe that you're an expert in this field, or that you've done a lot to prepare, or that you can say you don't know when a question's asked that you don't know, and you can say that with confidence and that's okay. You can also change your actual ability to cope. So for example, by again, over preparing, for example, if you are afraid that you are going to not know the answers to certain questions, you can practice with other people, have them ask you questions at the end, and then, maybe they'll come up with things that you hadn't thought of otherwise, and questions that your audience may potentially ask. So then rescue. How do we increase our confidence that we would be quote unquote rescued in an awful or scary or anxiety provoking situation? Well, for public speaking in particular, a lot of people have fear that they are going to freeze up and not be able to continue with the speech. And if you ask the person what their thoughts are on what would happen if they were to freeze up, you can tell that they're sort of imagining a scenario where there's absolutely no one to rescue or to come in and help or support them. So what you really find when, something happens during a public performance or something like that, it's not that everybody sits there indefinitely staring at you until you figure out what you're doing. Somebody takes over, or somebody helps you out, or somebody starts supporting you or claps for you. And I've been to plays before where someone, fell or made a mistake or tripped, and the audience, once they get back up, they start clapping, and then they're rooting for them the entire rest of the play. So that would be an example of, people actually probably aren't as bad as your brain thinks that they are, because again, your brain is going to be thinking of these worst case scenarios, and nobody's going to start throwing rotten tomatoes at you. They're actually generally rooting for you and are going to be pretty supportive. So if you are having trouble implementing these strategies and find that it's still really difficult for you to cope with this, you may need a little bit of extra help. So just reach out to somebody for help. And like I said, more videos incoming, so please subscribe if you're not already, and hit the like button if this is something that's been helpful for you. That way I know to make more content like this. All right, guys, hope everybody's having a good weekend, and hang in there. We'll get through this together.